There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than any words ever could. When someone who spent years proving themselves to the world meets someone who's never needed to prove anything at all. This is the story of what happened when Jean-Claude Van Damme, a man whose entire career was built on image and spectacle, tried to intimidate Chuck Norris at a private martial arts gathering in Los Angeles. What Van Damme expected was submission, maybe even admiration. What he got instead was something he'd never experienced before, the kind of quiet that makes you question everything you thought you knew about strength. This isn't just about two legendary martial artists in the same room. It's about what happens when ego collides with wisdom, when performance meets authenticity, and when someone finally learns that the most dangerous opponents are the ones who have nothing to prove. By the time Chuck Norris was done responding, Van Damme would walk away changed forever, and everyone who witnessed it would understand why some legends are whispered about with reverence, while others are simply talked about. The ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in downtown Los Angeles was filled with the kind of people who moved through life with a certain gravity. This wasn't a public event. No cameras, no press. Just an annual gathering of martial artists, stunt coordinators, and action choreographers who'd shaped Hollywood's understanding of combat for decades. The chandeliers cast warm light across circular tables where conversations hummed with the comfortable familiarity of old colleagues. These were people who bled together on set, who'd pushed their bodies past reasonable limits, who understood the difference between movie magic and real skill. Chuck Norris sat at a corner table with three former students, men in their 50s now, but still carrying themselves with the discipline he'd instilled in them decades ago. He wore a simple black jacket over a white shirt, his presence understated in a way that only comes from genuine confidence. At 78, he'd long since stopped needing to announce himself. The lines on his face told stories of a life fully lived, and his eyes held the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are and being completely comfortable with it. He listened more than he spoke, occasionally offering a quiet observation that made his companions lean in closer. Across the room, Jean-Claude Van Damme made an entrance. He was 60 now, still carrying the physique that had defined his career, his movements calculated to draw attention. His shirt was unbuttoned just enough to show he was still in fighting shape, his hair swept back in that familiar style, his expression carrying that intensity he perfected on camera. He moved through the room with the energy of someone who needed people to notice, stopping at various tables, greeting people with that theatrical warmth that walked the line between charm and performance. Several people responded with genuine affection. Van Damme had always been charismatic, always been able to work a room. But there was something in the way he kept scanning the space, the way his eyes kept drifting toward that corner table where Chuck Norris sat. Van Damme had been riding a wave of renewed attention lately. A few viral videos, some successful comeback films, interviews where he talked about legacy and respect. He'd been vocal about his place in martial arts cinema, about his contributions, about how he brought a different style to the screen. And in those interviews, when asked about other action stars, he'd develop a habit of subtle digs, of positioning himself as the more technical fighter, the more dedicated artist. He'd never directly challenged Chuck Norris, but the implications were there in his words, in the way he compared tournament records, in the way he talked about traditional martial arts versus modern screen combat. Tonight, surrounded by peers and perhaps feeling emboldened by his recent resurgence, Van Damme decided it was time to settle something. Not with fists, of course. This was a professional gathering, but with words, with presence, with the kind of dominance that could be established through sheer force of personality. He'd spent his entire career being the guy who kicked high, who did the splits, who looked incredible on camera. Now he wanted to be recognized as something more. And in his mind, that recognition required putting someone else in their place. He finished the conversation with a stunt coordinator, laughed at something that probably wasn't that funny, and then turned toward Chuck's table with deliberate intent. The conversations around him began to quiet. People who'd been in this industry long enough recognized the energy shift, the way the room's attention started to focus on a single point. Van Damme walked slowly, letting each step carry weight, his expression settling into something between confidence and challenge. Chuck noticed him coming. Of course he did. When you spend decades training to read body language, to anticipate movement, to understand intent before it becomes action, you don't miss things like this. But he didn't change his posture, didn't prepare himself for confrontation. He simply finished the sentence he was speaking to his former student, took a sip of water, and looked up as Van Damme reached the table. The three men sitting with Chuck immediately recognized what was happening. They'd seen this before, in different contexts, different venues. Someone approaching their teacher with something to prove, with an agenda, with a need to test themselves against a reputation. Usually it was younger fighters, cocky and inexperienced. Seeing it from someone of Van Damme's age and accomplishments felt strange, almost sad. Van Damme stood at the edge of the table, positioning himself, so he was slightly elevated, so Chuck would have to look up at him. It was a subtle power play, the kind of thing he'd learned from years of being in front of cameras, understanding angles and presence. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Chucknorris, Van Damme said, his accent making the name sound almost musical. The legend himself. I've been wanting to have a conversation with you. Chuck looked at him with those steady eyes, the kind that had stared down hundreds of opponents in competition, that had faced real danger in military service, that had seen enough of life to not be rattled by theater. Jean-Claude, he said simply, good to see you. Van Damme pulled out a chair without being invited and sat down, turning it slightly so he faced Chuck directly, cutting the other three men out of the conversation. I've been thinking, he continued, leaning forward, about legacy, about who really changed martial arts and film, about who brought real technique to the screen versus who just knew how to market themselves. The words landed exactly as they were intended, not quite a direct insult, but close enough that everyone at the table understood the implication. Chuck's former students tensed, but Chuck himself remained completely still, his expression unchanged. He understood what this was. He'd seen it countless times. Insecurity dressed up as confidence. The need for validation masquerading as strength. There's room for all kinds of contributions, Chuck said quietly. The industry's been good to a lot of people. Van Damme shook his head, that theatrical intensity building. No. That's what people say when they want to be diplomatic. But we both know there are levels. Competition records, tournament wins, real fighting versus movie fighting. Some of us came from actual combat sports. Some of us just learned enough to look good on camera. Around them, conversations had stopped completely. People were watching now, some uncomfortable, some curious, all of them recognizing this moment for what it was. Van Damme was doing this publicly, forcing a response, trying to establish dominance in front of an audience that knew better. One of Chuck's former students, a man named Marcus who'd studied under him for 15 years, started to speak up, but Chuck raised a hand slightly. Just a small gesture, barely noticeable, but Marcus immediately went quiet. This was Chuck's moment to handle, his decision to make about how to respond. Jean-Claude, Chuck said, his voice still carrying that same calm tone. What exactly are you trying to say? Van Damme leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms in a gesture of false openness. I'm saying that maybe the wrong people got the legend status. Maybe some reputations are built more on image than substance. Maybe if we're being honest about who could actually fight, who has the real technique, the real dedication, the results would surprise people. There it was. The challenge. Not physical, not here and now, but the implication was clear. Van Damme was suggesting that Chuck's reputation was undeserved, that his legendary status was more myth than reality, that if push came to shove, the outcome might not be what people expected. Chuck looked at him for a long moment. In his mind, he was making calculations, but not the kind Van Damme expected. He wasn't thinking about how to win this exchange, how to dominate the conversation, how to put this man in his place. He was thinking about what this moment revealed about Van Damme himself. The desperation underneath the bravado. The fear that drives people to tear others down. The emptiness that comes from building your entire identity on external validation. You want to know something about legends? Chuck finally said, his voice quiet enough that people at nearby tables leaned in to hear. Real legends don't happen because someone decides to build one. They happen because of how you treat people when nobody's watching. Because of what you do for others when there's nothing in it for you. Because of the character you show when you have nothing to prove. Van Damme's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the response he'd expected. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe anger, possibly even fear. Not this quiet philosophy lesson. That's easy to say when everyone already treats you like you walk on water. Van Damme shot back, his voice rising slightly. But some of us had to fight for every bit of recognition. Some of us didn't have the luxury of being handed respect. Some of us had to prove ourselves every single day. Chuck nodded slowly, and in that gesture was something that cut deeper than any argument could have. It was understanding, not agreement, but the recognition of what was really happening here. He'd seen this pattern before, in students who came to him with chips on their shoulders, in fighters who were more concerned with being seen as tough than actually being effective, in men who built their identities on such shaky ground that any perceived slight felt like an existential threat. "You're right," Chuck said. "You have fought hard. I've seen your work. You're tremendously talented, and you've accomplished things that most people never will. You don't need to prove that to anyone, least of all to me." The words should have been disarming. They were kind, acknowledging, the kind of response that might have de-escalated the situation if Van Damme had been coming from a place of genuine insecurity looking for reassurance. But he wasn't. He was coming from a place of ego, and ego doesn't want reassurance. It wants conquest. "I don't need your validation," Van Damme said, standing up now, his voice carrying across the room. "What I need is for people to understand who the real martial artists are, who actually competed at the highest levels, who brought real technique to cinema, not just karate choreography from the 70s. The insult was direct now, unmistakable. Chuck style, his roots in Tang Soo Do and subsequent training, his approach to film fighting that had defined a generation of action movies, all of it dismissed as outdated and inferior. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably. This had gone beyond a simple disagreement. Van Damme was attacking not just Chuck's reputation, but his entire life's work. Chuck stood up slowly, not with the energy of confrontation, but with the deliberate movement of someone making a choice. He was still several inches shorter than Van Damme, still less physically imposing in the conventional sense, but as he rose, something in the room's energy shifted. People who knew Chuck, who'd trained with him, who'd seen what he was capable of, felt it immediately. It was the same presence he'd carried into tournament rings decades ago, the same calm that had preceded decisive victories, the same quiet certainty that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with absolute confidence in his own ability. "Let me tell you about technique," Chuck said, and for the first time, his voice carried an edge. Not anger, but something sharper. Authority. Technique isn't about how high you can kick. It's not about how flexible you are or how good you look doing a spinning heel kick for a camera. Technique is about efficiency, about understanding leverage and timing, about knowing when to move and when to be still, about respecting the art enough to know that it's not a performance, it's a discipline. Van Damme started to respond, but Chuck continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire room. "I've spent 60 years studying martial arts, not to be famous, not to build a brand, but because it taught me something about myself and about life. I competed when competition mattered to me, won when winning was what I needed, and stopped when I had nothing left to prove in a ring. I made movies because they gave me a platform to share something I loved, not because I needed the world to see how tough I was. And I've spent decades teaching people, try to pass on something meaningful, trying to help others find what martial arts gave me." He took a step closer to Van Damme, closing the distance between them, and in that movement was decades of training, of understanding how to control space, how to make someone feel your presence without aggression, You want to talk about real martial artists? Let's talk about what that means. It means humility. It means understanding that the belt you wear is less important than the person you become wearing it. It means knowing that every time you step onto a mat or into a ring, you're representing something bigger than yourself. It means respecting your opponents, your teachers, your art, and yourself enough to not need to tear others down to feel elevated. Van Damme's face had gone red. He'd wanted to dominate this conversation, to establish himself as a superior fighter, the more legitimate martial artist. Instead, he was being given a lesson in front of everyone who mattered in their industry. And the worst part was that Chuck wasn't even trying to humiliate him. He was simply speaking truth, and that truth was cutting deeper than any insult could have. "You think I'm diminishing your accomplishments," Chuck continued, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "I'm not. You've done remarkable things. But you're here tonight trying to take something from me that I never claimed in the first place. I don't call myself a legend. I don't spend my time comparing my career to others. I don't need to prove I'm legitimate because my legitimacy doesn't depend on anyone else's opinion." He paused, letting that sink in, and in the silence that followed, Van Damme seemed to deflate slightly. The energy he brought to this confrontation, the aggression and bravado, was meeting something it couldn't overcome. Not force, not dominance, but simple, unshakable presence. "Here's what I know about you," Chuck said, and now his tone carried something that sounded almost like compassion. "You're talented. You're dedicated. You've worked incredibly hard. But somewhere along the way, you started believing that respect was something you had to take from other people instead of something you earned by being worthy of it. You started thinking that putting others down would lift you up. And now you're here, at 60 years old, still trying to prove something to a room full of people who already know who you are." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement. Van Damme opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he say? Chuck hadn't insulted him, hadn't challenged him to a fight, hadn't even defended himself in the traditional sense. He'd simply held up a mirror, and what Van Damme saw reflected that it was uncomfortable enough that all his prepared arguments, all his tactical aggression, suddenly fell hollow. Chuck turned to his former students, who'd watched this entire exchange of expressions ranging from pride to concern. "Gentlemen, I think it's time we called a night." He picked up his jacket, nodded to a few people at nearby tables who'd been watching the exchange, and started to walk toward the exit. Van Damme stood there, frozen. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to have established dominance, to have put Chuck Norris in his place, to have walked away with everyone understanding that Jean-Claude Van Damme was a superior martial artist, the more legitimate fighter, the one who deserved the deeper respect. Instead, he felt smaller than he had in years, and he couldn't even articulate why. "Wait," he said, and his voice came out strange, missing all the confidence it had carried minutes before. Chuck stopped, turned back, waiting. Van Damme wanted to say something cutting, something that would salvage this moment, that would let him walk away feeling like he'd won something. But looking at Chuck's face, at that expression of calm patience, he couldn't find the words. For the first time in the conversation, he was genuinely lost. "Why didn't you fight back?" Van Damme finally asked, and there was something almost childlike in the question. "I came at you, in front of everyone, questioned everything about you. Why didn't you defend yourself?" Chuck looked at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, there was no triumph in his voice, no sense of victory. Just truth. "Because I don't need to," he said simply. "My work speaks for itself. The people I've trained speak for me. The life I've lived is my defense. You came here tonight looking for a fight, Jean-Claude, but the only person you're really fighting is yourself. And that's a fight I can't help you win." He nodded once more and walked toward the exit, his former students following. The room remained quiet as they left. Dozens of martial artists and industry professionals processing what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't a fight. There had been no physical confrontation, no dramatic finishing move. But everyone present understood that something significant had just happened. They watched someone try to take something that wasn't theirs to take, and they'd watched that attempt dissolve against simple, unshakable integrity. Van Damme stood alone at the table, the adrenaline that had fueled his confrontation draining away and leaving behind something that felt uncomfortably like shame. People were starting to return to their own conversations, the moment passing, but he could feel the shift in how they looked at him, not with fear or respect, but with something closer to pity. He sat down heavily, his mind racing through the exchange, trying to find moments where he'd won, where he'd established something. But all he could see was Chuck's face, that expression of calm understanding, those words about fighting yourself. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Van Damme felt the weight of his own insecurities, stripped of all the performance and bravado that usually let him ignore them. A stunt coordinator he'd worked with years ago approached the table cautiously. "You okay, Jean-Claude?" Van Damme looked up at him, and for just a moment his mask slipped completely. "Did you see that?" he asked. "Did you see what he did?" The coordinator nodded. "Yeah, I saw." "He didn't fight me," Van Damme said, almost himself. "I gave him every reason to come back at me, to prove something, and he just didn't." "That's Chuck," the coordinator said quietly. "That's who he is. That's why people respect him. Not because he's the toughest guy in the room, but because he's the most secure one. He doesn't need to prove anything, because he already knows who he is." Van Damme sat with that for a moment, and in the silence, something began to crack. All those years of building his image, of fighting for recognition, of needing to be seen as the best, the strongest, the most legitimate. And here was someone who'd achieved everything Van Damme had been chasing, not by demanding respect, but by being worthy of it. Not by tearing others down, but by building himself up. Not by proving his strength, but by being so secure in it that he never needed to prove anything at all. The next morning, Van Damme sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. He'd been looking at old interviews, old statements he'd made about other martial artists, about his place in the hierarchy of action stars. He saw himself through new eyes now, and what he saw made him uncomfortable. All the subtle digs, all the comparisons, all the need to position himself as superior. It all looked so small now, so insecure, so desperate. He thought about calling Chuck, about apologizing. But what would he say? Sorry for trying to publicly humiliate you? Sorry for questioning your entire legacy? Sorry for being so insecure in my own accomplishments that I needed to tear down yours? Instead, he sat with the discomfort, let it work on him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to really feel the emptiness underneath all the performance, all his bravado. And in that space, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that he understood he had a choice. He could keep being the person who needed to prove something, or he could start becoming the person who didn't. 3 months later, Van Damme was giving an interview for a martial arts documentary. The interviewer asked him about his place among action movie legends, about how he compared himself to contemporaries like Chucknorris. Van Damme paused for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried something it hadn't before. "Chucknorris is a legend because he earned it the right way," Van Damme said. "Not by talking about it, not by comparing himself to others, but by being excellent at what he does, and then being humble about that excellence. I've learned something from him recently about the difference between strength and needing people to see your strength. Real power doesn't announce itself. It just is." The interviewer looked surprised at the response, clearly expecting something more self-promotional. "That's a pretty generous assessment." Van Damme smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it was genuine. "It's the truth, and I'm done pretending truth is something you need to spin or perform. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be legends. Others just live with integrity and become legends as a side effect. I know which one I want to be now." The story of that night at the Fairmont spread through the martial arts community, as these stories do. Not sensationalized, not exaggerated, but told with a kind of reverence for what had actually happened. People who'd been there share it with others. It became one of those moments that defined not just who Chuck Norris was, but what martial arts could teach you about life itself. Chuck never spoke publicly about the incident. He didn't need to add his version, didn't need to claim victory or establish his perspective as a definitive one. He simply continued being who he'd always been, teaching when asked, sharing when appropriate, living his life with the same quiet integrity that had defined him for decades. Because that's what real strength looks like. Not the strength to dominate others, but the strength to remain yourself when someone tries to pull you down to their level. Not the strength to win arguments, but the strength to understand when engaging in an argument would diminish both parties. Not the strength to prove your worth, but the strength to know your worth so completely that no external validation is required. Legends aren't built in moments of confrontation. They're built in years of consistent character, in thousands of small choices to be better rather than just appear better, in the daily practice of integrity, when it would be easier to compromise. They're built by understanding that your reputation is what other people say about you, but your character is what you are when no one's watching. Van Damme learned something that night that changed the trajectory of his later years. He learned that the respect he'd been fighting for his entire career couldn't be taken or demanded. It had to be earned through the person you become, the way you treat others, the grace you show when you have every reason to be graceless. He learned that strength without humility is just performance, and performance without substance eventually reveals itself as empty. The most powerful lesson came in what Chuck didn't do. He didn't embarrass Van Damme, though he easily could have. He didn't humiliate him publicly, though the setup was perfect for it. He didn't use his reputation as a weapon, though it would have been devastating. Instead, he offered truth delivered with compassion, mirror held up with kindness, and in doing so, gave Van Damme something more valuable than victory or defeat. He gave him the opportunity to grow. In the years that followed, when people asked Chuck about that night, on the rare occasions he addressed it at all, he would simply say, Jean-Claude is a talented martial artist who was struggling with something a lot of people struggle with. We all have moments where we need to prove something. The question is whether we learn from those moments or keep repeating them. And when people asked Van Damme, he became increasingly honest about what happened and what it meant. I went looking for a fight and found a teacher instead. He'd say, sometimes the most important lessons come from the confrontations you lose, especially when you lose them without a single punch being thrown. Here's what matters in the end. The strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who have nothing to prove. The most respected individuals are those who never demand respect. The true warriors are the ones who fought enough battles to understand that the most important victories are the ones achieved without fighting at all. Chucknorris embodied that truth in a moment when he could have chosen combat, could have chosen ego, could have chosen to meet aggression with aggression. Instead, he chose presence, chose truth, chose to be exactly who he'd always been, and in doing so, taught everyone watching what real strength actually looks like. When someone tries to diminish you, to challenge your worth, to take something from you that they haven't earned, remember this. The people who truly belong at the top never need to push anyone else down to get there. They rise through the quality of their character, the consistency of their integrity, and the grace they show even to those who show them none. That's not weakness. That's the most powerful form of strength there is, the kind that changes hearts instead of just winning arguments, the kind that builds legends that last because they're built on truth. And sometimes the most devastating response to aggression isn't force. It's the simple, quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly who they are and needs nothing from you to confirm it.